All right, let's get started. I'm glad you're here. We're going to talk about Shakespeare and comedy, making us laugh. So let's get going. All right, so let's start with some definitions. I'm not going to read everything on the screen for you. I think you can read that for yourself. But if we're looking at where did the etymology of the word comedy, where it began, and you can see Middle English, medieval Latin, and then you can see the Latin with a happy ending. And then I want you to come back. Well, we will be coming back to some of these ideas from the Greek perception of and definition of comedy later. So it's as early as the 14th century. A couple of things that you're going to see, whether it's Middle English, Latin, Greek perspective, it's a narrative that ends happily, right? There's a comic style. There can also be a comic theme. And you've got, it's considered light, amusing, a character typically with a happy ending, light or satirical elements. It can even be farcical, right? It can be a farce. So there's all sorts of ways to view it. As Dr. Samuel Johnson, who devised one of the first English dictionaries, wrote this quotation: "Comedy has been unpropitious, unfavorable to definers." And I think this is something that we really want to keep in mind when we're thinking about comedy. Look at those definitions that I provided you. Think about over time. There's as many definitions for comedy as there are people who enjoy comedy. And aren't there many different types of comedy? And some comedy, some of us like, some of us don't like. And some of us find some things funny, while we don't find other things funny. So we've certainly got a discordant definition happening. And this is also true among scholars. Many scholars agree on the definition of tragedy. But there's much less unity when we attempt to define comedy. We've also got the culture gives meaning. I don't know if you've tried to watch comedy shows from different people with different comedians from different cultures, or television shows, whatever it may be. But each culture also has its own sense of humor and its own idioms and its own metaphors and all of these things that may go over the head of listeners, audience members who aren't a part of that culture. What most agree upon is that comedy is usually dependent on the particulars of a given culture. So that will also mean that it could be dependent on a culture in a given time, in a given place as well, right? So things that might have been funny to Shakespeare's audience may not strike the same chord with some of us, but the comedy that transcends time and place and is more part of the human condition and about humanity, I think that can translate. So some interesting things when we're thinking about comedy. In 1973, Shakespearean scholar Bertrand Evans, who wrote Shakespeare's comedies in 1960, noted, quote, "To date, no one has been quite successful in composing a definition of Shakespearean comedy that is at the same time broad enough and precise enough to be of much use." So what we're gathering from Bertrand Evans is that Shakespeare has a lot that he does with his comedy, and it's all-encompassing, but there are also very specific things to Shakespeare and his comedy that are very precise. So I think that this makes it difficult for those of us studying Shakespeare and Shakespeare's comedies, right? So there are three. I think it's important for us to go back in history to the divisions of ancient Greek comedy, the old, middle, and new, because I think we will have a better understanding of what Shakespeare does with comedy in his plays, because he does pull from those traditions, but much like everything else he does, he makes it uniquely his own. And so I think it's good for you to have foundational knowledge, and this might be a review for some of you, but I want you to have a foundational knowledge so that you can kind of look for different elements of the old, middle, and new comedy and see if Shakespeare's employing any of those techniques or perspectives. So when we think about old Greek comedy, we're thinking of Aristophanes as the best example. And there's a mix of dance, poetry, song, and drama. There's also a combination of fantastic plots. There's sharp satire of contemporary events and people. And like we've discussed in class, Shakespeare isn't a satirist exactly, but he could be employing elements of satire in his plays when he's presenting his social corrective arguments or messages through the storytelling. We're also going to have an unlikely association between democracy and freedom of speech. It's important to recognize that at its earliest category of comedy, it's associated with democracy and freedom of speech. And so I want us to keep this in mind, even in light of some of the conversations we've had in class about how Shakespeare might be using the plays to put forward a more democratic idea and using his writing of plays as a possible form of free speech. Now, he certainly is not living in a democratic society under Queen Elizabeth or under King James the First, but he is walking a fine line, isn't he? With what is socially acceptable for him to say, politically acceptable for him to say, what is lawfully acceptable for him to say without being called out for treason. And so I want us to see if we think he's doing that at all. Middle comedy, this flourished in approximately 400 to 388 BC. We have, it's mainly associated with Aristophanes' Plutus, which is the last surviving play. It is filled with much milder in its criticism of people, places, and things, and it's considered to be a satire of the whole, which refers to a satire of all different types of people rather than simply individuals. It's also thought to speak in very general terms of the evils of society rather than discuss specific corruption and political problems. And then this middle comedy also takes place in an environment in which freedom of speech is repressed, particularly following the defeat of Athens in the Peloponnesian War. And so you can see again, when there's restrictions by the society or the people in power politically, how does a society address the failings or the faultiness or the problems with a given ruling group? And it's often through comedy, don't you think? And think about even our current 2020s time, right? What are we doing? What do our comedians do? What do our comedy shows do to help to try to address, even if we have freedom of speech or if we have some political folks who are a little bit less open to some elements of freedom of speech? So we've got the new comedy began to appear in 336. It features a chorus, which has been transformed into a group of singers and dancers who perform in interludes rather than participating in significant parts of the play and taking on major roles in the play, like we see particularly in Greek tragedy. And then with the contemporary characters, here the characters and situations are drawn from contemporary life. We also have the characters are principally types, like stereotypes, caricatures, or tropes, you might even say, rather than individuals. And then you have plots of chiefly designed around domestic problems and conflicts, such as love, marriage, and offspring. And then with the survival of the fittest, though many comedies were written in this style of new comedy, only one entire play by Menander survives. So now let's shift and see what are the sort of types of Shakespearean tragedy. And then you can see of the 3 comedies that we're going to be reading and studying, which do you think employ which characteristic or reflect which type of Shakespearean comedy. So scholars have essentially broken down Shakespeare's comedies into these following categories. And we will spend some time looking at a few different elements of each. We talked about body comedy earlier. That's dealing with the sort of 8 and 10-year-old jokes, right? The fart jokes, the body, the physicality jokes. Maybe we would call it like slapstick, right? But it also goes into the sexual with the different phallic and yonic symbols, with the physicality of sex act and things like that too. So we have a few different elements with the body in that way. So 14 of 35 plays in the folio. We say Shakespeare wrote 38, but some of those plays weren't included in the folio, so that's why we're talking about 35. And the first folio is what I'm speaking of, and we'll talk about that in another video, so you can be on the lookout for that. But 14 of the 35 plays in the first folio, which were published by Shakespeare actors in Shakespeare's acting company, were placed under the heading of comedies. 2 of these, The Tempest and The Winter's Tale, are considered to be romances, which is a subset of comedy, inclining toward the tragic comic, with joyful endings reflecting the spirit of comedy. And then there are also problem comedies. 2 others, All's Well That Ends Well and Measure for Measure, are often classified as problem comedies because they deal with intractable social problems and end in problematic marriages, even though they do provide some humorous scenes and characters. And even some of the history plays will contain elements of comedy, even though they aren't called comedies and they don't fall within the more contemporary category of romances. But Shakespeare does infuse humor in each of his plays, and and often that's because of the catharsis that's necessary with tragedy, right? You need that release of tension when you're dealing with such heavy comments, so you have the comedic relief, right? But there can be other elements in the histories as well. Some characteristics that you can find in Shakespearean comedy. So the laughing, it makes people laugh. The play ends happily. There are happy endings. Virtually all people, by nature of their folly, are candidates for comedy. So he's democratic in that he makes fun of people from all walks of life. Often the comedy springs from human weakness. And I want us to think about, is it weakness? Is it perceived weakness? Is it, what do we think about that? the comedy is also immersed in a social world, and so there's social awareness in the storytelling and what is highlighted in the comedy. Uh, the comedies are sometimes referred to as benevolent because Shakespeare is not as harshly critical of his comic creations as other authors and contemporaries like Ben Jonson or Moliere. Social corrective. You've heard me say this a few times. Often, Shakespeare's comedy plays serve as social correctives as his plays challenge societal norms. So I want you to think about, is he doing that? Is he not doing that? We've also talked about the subversiveness of Shakespeare a little bit, and his comedies especially can be very subversive. Consider the elements of inversion that we were discussing in some of our early conversations and that we'll come back to in the future. And then frequently, the comedies are initiated by an irrational law, the action of the comedy, that the action of the comedy eventually overturns. And when we're talking about A Midsummer Night's Dream and Hermia and Aegeus calling forth the letter of the law against his daughter because she won't abide by his authority over her that is granted to him by the law, not only social law, but the law of the land, the legal law, is Shakespeare calling this out as an irrational law. See how that plays out as you read the play and other plays and different laws that are being challenged. So we have additional characteristics of Shakespearean comedy. We've talked about Northrop Frye's Greenworld, the contrast of the natural laws of Frye's Greenworld with the artifice and the artificial laws of the court world. We've got a spirit of carnival, it's party time, among the primary impulses underlying the different comedies. And there's often dress up. Shakespeare loves to play with masking and costumes, particularly having women in men's clothing, a lot of cross-dressing happening, and they're central components to many Shakespearean comedies. He'll also call out to the fact that on the stage, it's primarily male actors because women were legally not allowed to act on the stage during Shakespeare's time. And Shakespeare doesn't seem to be a fan of that. So he often highlights the fact that the female characters are being played by men, ultimately in drag, right? So in Shakespeare's mature comedies, he's thought to upset the apple cart by typically a woman subverts the status quo to forge a better society. And what you will find, even if they aren't happy marriages, that at the end of Shakespearean comedies, they often end with a marriage, or two or three, depending. There's often a dance, a banquet. These are joyful ceremonies which distinguish his more festive comedies. So different plays that fit within different elements. You can see the more social correctives are thought to be The Taming of the Shrew, A Midsummer Night's Dream, and As You Like It. We'll be reading a few of those this semester. And then masks, costumes, and cross-dressing, Merchant of Venice, As You Like It, Two Gentlemen of Verona, and Twelfth Night. Although it's not listed on here, we also have some masking happening in Much Ado About Nothing. So that one also has some interesting things happening with masking. In terms of the carnival background, we have the Feast of Fools. It began in the Middle Ages with a holiday known as the Feast of Fools. And then you've got it gave license to people to celebrate freedom from restraints, wear masks, wear festive costumes. It allowed people to dress in different social classes in Shakespeare's time. it was illegal for someone from the lower class to wear some, even the materials that lords and ladies would wear. And they could be jailed for that. So the class hierarchical structure and stratification is so strict that even it applies to how people dress and the types of materials they can use. But when you're in this Feast of Fools, you have a liberating element to it. That's something unique about the theater too. We have these actors who are dressing as monarchs and wearing the same opulent sort of clothes, which is some of the reasons why some of the Puritans wanted to shut down the theaters. But we'll talk about that in another video. The carnival-esque elements of many of Shakespeare's comedies, if not all of them, allow for a time of role reversals as underlings mocked royalty, while those in power often played commoners. And then men dressed as women, women dressed as men, but interestingly, it would be a man dressed as a woman who then was dressing like a man, because it was only men performing on the stage. You've got the Lord of Misrule, mock king embodying the spirit of anarchy, who presided over the festivities. And these are a couple of John Falstaff and Toby Belch are some characters that you can keep in mind as some of the strongest examples of Shakespeare's best-known lords of misrule. In terms of marriage, we have ancient remnants remnants of ancient rites of marriage making their way through the comedy plays. This concept of komos, the Greeks refer to these unions as komos. It's a joyful union, which marks a new beginning for those who have endured the chaos of the play's action. Also included in komos, it suggests fertility as being symbolized in the marriages themselves, the coupling of these heterosexual couples who will go forward and procreate. You've got long life being symbolized in the banquets that accompany the marriages and the comedies that nourish life. You've also got a concept of harmonious restoration. Often it's the community's social order that's symbolized in the dances that they do and any sort of circling community building that sort of happens at the conclusions of the plays. But I want you to keep in mind the restoration of the community's social order in Shakespeare's plays. Is the social order always what it was? Or is there going to be a new social order that might be new and improved? More hopeful for the future generations. So I want you to sort of keep that in mind as you're looking into that and reading the different plays. We've talked a little bit about Shakespeare's language, so I'm not going to go a whole lot into it. But as you can imagine, much of Shakespeare's comedy comes from his ingenious wordplay and diction. And so we've talked about his pun use, and the humorous use of a word in such a way as to suggest two or more of its meanings or the meaning of another word similar in sound. We talked about malapropisms, the usually unintentional humorous misuse or distortion of a word or phrase, especially when we're thinking of one word that sounds somewhat like another word, but then is used ludicrously in an incorrect context. And then these elaborate turns of phrase, Shakespeare's artful phrasing of words. When it comes to his puns, puns were especially common during Shakespeare's times and is very common within his plays. Much to the chagrin of many scholars, Dr. Samuel Johnson attributes such wordplay to, quote, some malignant power over Shakespeare's mind, end quote. So some people really think puns are the lowest form of comedy and intellect. I beg to differ. I think a really good pun, it takes effort, it takes intellect, it takes wit to do that. Um, most of Shakespeare's plays contain about 80 puns. In Love's Labor is Lost, there's 200. It's a comedy of manners that satirizes the newly educated and features almost 200 puns. Um, some scenes are built entirely on puns to be intentionally silly as well as genuinely witty. And for Shakespeare, puns were not always the lowest form of humor. So take that, Samuel Johnson. So we've talked about this, but the misuse of one word when another is intended, that's a malpropism. It's quite the opposite of puns. It often is intended to indicate a lack of education and sophistication. It's a technique Shakespeare uses to create likable characters like Bottom in A Midsummer Night's Dream. There's something rather than just simply always making fun of or deriding someone who uses malpropisms. Often it's something that makes that character more endearing and likable. And although Shakespeare excels at the use of malaprop in his plays, the term originates with the character named Mrs. Malaprop, created by Richard Brinsley Sheridan in his still popular English comedy, The Rivals from 1775. All right, just when you think we're done, we got it. So go forth, laugh heartily, draw out some stuff as you're reading, pull and make meaning as you chuckle, and I look forward to talking more about and sharing more comedies with you soon. Take care.